Good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. It's good to have you with us. We are nearly there. The Conservative leadership race has lasted 5 weeks, even if it's felt at times like 5 years. And tomorrow, we finally find out who will be our next Prime Minister, Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. And whoever it is, they're going to have to hit the ground running with spiralling energy bills, a creaking NHS and big questions about the union. All this with Boris Johnson looking over their shoulder, who will step down on Tuesday, even though some in his party wish he wouldn't. Lots to discuss with our guests this morning, and we have got a great lineup for you to do it with. We'll be talking to the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, this morning, someone who Liz Truss described as an attention seeker who should be ignored. We'll find out what the SNP leader makes of that. Someone who knows a thing or two about shepherding the UK economy through choppy waters, Philip, now Lord Hammond, became Chancellor after the Brexit referendum. He will also join us live. And the Conservative Big Beast David Davis will give us a sense of the mood among Conservative MPs just a day before they find out who will be their new leader. For Labour, we'll be talking to the Shadow International Trade Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds, on the show today. And we'll also be trying to find out just how serious the impact of the energy price crisis is for small businesses with Abbie Marshall, who owns the Buck Inn in North Yorkshire. Plus, we'll also be reflecting on Boris Johnson's time in the job he always wanted, with someone who was by his side throughout, his one-time Chief Strategic Advisor, No. 10 Chief of Staff, Lord Lister, his first interview since leaving Downing Street. Now, unless there's a really big shock tomorrow, Liz Truss looks set to win the Conservative leadership race and become the next Prime Minister. One of the most important relationships for whoever the new Prime Minister will be is going to be with the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, someone Liz Truss has described as an attention seeker who should be ignored. Well, we can talk now to Nicola Sturgeon to get her take on the leadership race, but also, of course, on the cost of living crisis that is hitting people across the United Kingdom. Thank you so much. It's great to have you on the first show back after the summer recess. Now, it's almost certain that Liz Truss is going to be announced tomorrow as the next Prime Minister of the UK. Do you think she'll be an improvement on Boris Johnson?
The hard question to start with. Look, time will tell. It's obviously the case that Liz Truss and I don't agree on very much politically, but I'm a firm believer in giving anybody who's coming into the office of Prime Minister a chance to prove themselves, and I will certainly do my best to build a constructive working relationship with her. Remember, she will be, if it is indeed Liz Truss tomorrow, she will be the fourth Prime Minister that I've had to deal with in my time as First Minister. And despite my differences with David Cameron, Theresa May, perhaps less so with Boris Johnson, but it wasn't for the want of trying, I've managed to have decent working relationships, and I'll certainly try to do that with Liz Truss as well. I think everybody will want to see what she is going to do. She faces, as all of us do right now, immense challenges. I hope the very first thing she does in office is cancel the looming increase in energy prices, the increase in the energy price cap, and deliver some very substantial help to individuals and businesses. The one thing I would say is that if she governs as she has campaigned over the summer, she will be a disaster, not just for Scotland, but for all of the UK. But let's hope that's not the case, because this is a very serious time for the UK and it needs very serious and very purposeful leadership.
You say if she governs as she has campaigned, she will be a disaster. Why do you think that?
Well, because she has campaigned on the very, how can I say this politely, niche priorities of 100,000 members of the Conservative Party, you know, focusing on things like tax cuts that would benefit the very richest when it is ordinary people across the country who desperately need help to feed their children and heat their homes. You know, there's been a focus on what the Conservatives would describe as as woke politics, rhetoric that looks as if it is rowing back on the moral obligation we all have to tackle the climate emergency, which, as it happens, is also the right thing to do over the long term to lower energy prices and improve energy security. So the obsessions of a tiny number of Conservative Party members are not the right priorities for the country. So I think it won't take very long to see whether she is going to govern as a Prime Minister with a focus on the real priorities of the country or not. I think that will become very obvious and evident perhaps within the first 24 or 48 hours of her premiership. So let's hope she chooses the responsible course and stops pandering to the margins and the Conservative Party.
It does, as you say, feel like we're going to find out the direction of travel pretty soon. She's written in the Sunday Telegraph today saying she's going to have immediate action on energy bills, but also, of course, talking an awful lot about tax cuts. Are you concerned that if she does push ahead with tax cuts, as we believe is likely, to say the least, what impact that could have on the spending envelope for Scotland? And whatever happens, do you think you're going to have to do an emergency budget in response to the new Prime Minister?
Well, we're undertaking an emergency budget review right now, and we are committed to setting out the outcome of that effectively in an emergency budget within a couple of weeks of whatever budget or fiscal event the new Prime Minister has. Now, we don't know for sure when that will happen or what form that will take, but our working assumption is there will be something of that nature by the end of September. I certainly think that is necessary. And to your question, yes, I am profoundly concerned about the potential impacts of that on the Scottish Government's budget, and I know my counterparts in Wales and Northern Ireland will have the same concerns. I mean, right now we are working within budgets that are effectively fixed and finite. They are not rising in line with inflation, but the inflationary pressures are bearing down on our budget as they are on the household budgets of families across the country. Any move, and this is a real risk, that would cut our budgets within this financial year would obviously be of profound concern, because it would have big implications for the National Health Service, for local authority budgets, for every aspect of our spending. One of the things we've been trying to do within that finite budget is help those who most need it. We have established a Scottish child payment support that doesn't exist anywhere else in the UK, currently giving £20 per week per child to the lowest income families. We have plans to increase that to £25 a week. Real tangible help at this time of crisis, and we don't want anything that reduces our ability to do other things to help. But my other concern about tax cuts is that they target those who are already the best off. Many people who are really struggling right now already don't pay income tax and wouldn't benefit from a cut there, and wouldn't benefit in the same way that richer people would from a cut in national insurance, for example. So this is a time to focus on what is really needed. Freeze energy prices first and foremost. Come to an arrangement then between government and the energy companies about how that is paid back over a longer period of time. Effectively spread and share the burden of the soaring gas prices. Help businesses, because businesses don't even have the limited protection of an energy price cap. Get more cash into the pockets of those who need it most, and free up more spending ability for the devolved government so we can do more to protect public services and public sector workers right now. So there's a package that a new Prime Minister could bring to bear, and it would deliver real help and relief to millions across the UK.
I guess just to put the counter-argument on tax cuts is that Liz Truss and those around her would argue that cutting taxes helps boost growth, which would then help the economy through that sense. You mentioned as well energy bills and action on energy bills. Liz Truss has said she would take immediate action on that. There are reports that that could include more drilling licences in the North Sea. Would you be happy to see more oil and gas taken from the North Sea to try and increase the energy supply?
But we've got to make a careful and just transition away from oil and gas. That's an imperative for the planet right now, but actually it is the way that we work towards greater energy security and lower energy bills. We are undertaking right now in the Scottish Government our own energy review, looking at the requirements over the longer term. But what is more important, I think, than continuing to explore for more oil and gas is that we fully support the renewable energy transition. So we've just had an auction round in the North Sea, which has given the initial go-ahead to up to 28 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. That's the future. That also gives us enormous potential in green hydrogen to help fulfil our own energy needs, but also can be a big export potential. So that's what I said earlier on. We need to support oil and gas as it transitions, and there's lots of workers in Scotland dependent on that industry right now. So I'm not complacent about that, but it is the wrong priority if you take your eye off the renewables revolution and the renewables transition, and that's what worries me, as well as irresponsible talk about fracking, for example. Let's focus on making sure that we harness our renewables potential, which fulfils all of these important objectives in the longer term.
Now, I just want to talk a bit about independence. You have said that you want to hold another Scottish independence referendum in October 2023. Liz Truss, of course, during the Hustings campaign has said, if I'm elected Prime Minister, I will not allow another independence referendum. So she's been talking pretty tough on it. If Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister, do you think that does impact the chances of you holding another referendum?
Well, look, whether Scotland has a referendum, whether Scotland does or does not vote to be independent, it really shouldn't be up to any UK Prime Minister. Actually, it shouldn't be up to a First Minister either. This is about a fundamental principle of democracy. Now, there is going to be a Supreme Court hearing in October next month that will look at whether or not the Scottish Parliament has the legal ability to legislate for a referendum, regardless of what a UK Prime Minister says. I hope the outcome of that will be positive, but of course that is a matter for the court. What cannot be escaped here, whatever Liz Truss or any Prime Minister says, is the democratic aspirations of the people of Scotland. You say, I want to have a referendum next year. I do. But that's the basis on which I was elected First Minister last year. There is a democratic mandate. And my message to Liz Truss is not to say that I think I can persuade her to support independence. She is opposed to independence. She's entitled to have that view. But make the case for the continuation of the Union. I will make the case for independence and let the Scottish people decide. It is not a sign of strength on the part of Liz Truss to talk about blocking a referendum or, as some reports today suggest, gerrymandering the rules for a referendum. That is a sign of fundamental weakness and a lack of confidence in her case for the Union.
Let's talk about, you mentioned there about, as you put it, gerrymandering the rules. This is the reports in the Sunday Times that the Truss team want to introduce a new law that would mean a referendum could only take place. So if a referendum takes place, at least 50% of Scotland's entire electorate would have to vote to leave the Union for it to happen. So in other words, not a simple majority as we've seen in the EU referendum or in the previous referendum. For something as significant as breaking away from the Union, is that something that you would accept?
No, because it is a changing of the basic rules of democracy that we have all abided by for our entire lifetimes and long before that. Can you imagine the furore, the literal foaming at the mouth that we would have had from the Conservative Party if MD had suggested that for the Brexit referendum? You cannot, just because you fear losing a democratic contest, it's not an excuse or doesn't make it acceptable to try to rewrite the rules of democracy. That's my point here. There has never been a positive case for the Union made by those who put forward that case. In 2014, they tried, and got away with it in 2014, to scare people in Scotland. I remember back then there was all sorts of scare stories about all sorts of things, but including that our energy bills would go up.
Rather than getting too involved into the rights and wrongs of the arguments, which have been well rehearsed, I'm quite interested to know about how a referendum could actually take place, because another part of the Sunday Times report is saying that the UK government wouldn't consider allowing another referendum unless there was evidence for more than a year that at least 60% of voters wanted one. If you look at the recent polls, I think we can have a look at the YouGov tracker poll for support for independence, and you can see that it's actually waned recently. Do you think that this perhaps suggests that, at a time when people in Scotland are worried about turning their heating on, food banks are saying that people aren't picking up potatoes because they don't have the money to boil them, do you think people are worrying perhaps that independence is a distraction from the cost of living issues?
Well, it's not a distraction, and part of my job is to persuade people of that, because part of the reason we're in this mess right now is because we're not independent, and therefore we don't have the levers to try to navigate our way out of that. If Scotland was independent, we could already have passed an emergency budget. We'd have powers to reform the energy market to deal with some of the underlying causes of this. I wouldn't, as First Minister of Scotland, be sitting here right now, as we were discussing earlier on, profoundly concerned in case a Prime Minister in London that Scotland hasn't voted for is about to take decisions that cut our budget even more. We wouldn't have a position where we have to accept that people are reliant on food banks. Some of the action we have taken, the Scottish Child Payment that I mentioned earlier on, we could build on that because we'd have access to more levers and resources. Actually, independence is much more necessary when we're dealing with crisis, because it gives you more levers to navigate your way through and onto a better future. But the point I wanted to complete, it wasn't about getting into the substance. You asked me about all of these different stories about attempts on the part of UK governments to gerrymander the rules. Only politicians fearing the democratic outcome would ever contemplate that. Let's have the debate on substance, where I and my colleagues will make the case for independence, for Scotland becoming like other independent countries across the world, able to navigate our own future, and let people like Liz Truss make the case for the union. But then, democratically, let the people of Scotland decide. That's how democracy works. It's how democracy should always work.
You, at the beginning of the interview, you were talking about your relationship with other previous Prime Ministers, and I just want to touch upon your personal relationship with Liz Truss, because obviously personal relationships do matter in politics. And I think I can just play you what Liz Truss said at a hustings in August about you when she was asked. Let's have a listen.
I feel like I'm a child of the union, that I really believe we are a family and we're better together. And I think the best thing to do with Nicola Sturgeon is ignore her. She's an attention seeker, Seb. That's what she is.
She's an attention seeker, that's what she is. Are you really going to be able to work with Liz Truss?
I will do my best, and it is up to Liz Truss to decide whether she wants to work with me. Let's put the personal insults to one side. Again, coming back to the argument I made about if you're confident in your case, you don't need to try to block democracy or gerrymander democracy. Similarly, I'd say to Liz Truss,
just to come in, because I do think it's perhaps
you don't make.
Just to come in, because I do feel it is a two-way thing with you guys, I have to say. You recently said that the main thing Liz Truss wanted to talk to you about when she met you, I think quite recently, was how she could get into Vogue. I've just been interviewed by Vogue. You said that was the main thing she wanted to talk to me about. I remember it because we were there at the world's biggest climate change conference in Glasgow, and that was the main topic of conversation she was interested in pursuing. Just talk me through what happened there.
I was asked a question if I'd had a conversation with Liz Truss. It's the only sort of lengthy conversation or meaningful conversation I can recall having with Liz Truss, so I answered the question about what we talked about. Look, I'm perfectly willing to not to put our political differences aside, because in a democracy you have political debates, but I will, as I did with David Cameron, Theresa May, to some extent Boris Johnson, although I think most people would recognise that was more difficult, to build a working relationship. I'm not perfect. I'm not saying that I'm blameless when those relationships go through difficulties, but I will try to build that relationship. But the point I was making is that her comment about ignoring me is in a similar vein to trying to block democracy. You don't make a problem that you fear you can't solve properly go away by simply ignoring it. You engage in democratic debate. And I'm a politician. I mean, part of your job as a politician is to get attention for yourself, your policies, your values. I mean, I don't mean this pejoratively, but I've never looked at Liz Truss and thought that she was some kind of shrinking violet. And that's not a criticism. In politics, that's part of the job that you have to do. But the ignoring point is perhaps more fundamental because, look, some people in Scotland vote for me and my party. Some people don't. Some people like me. Some people loathe me. That's democracy. But I am the democratically elected First Minister of my country. And that means quite a lot of people have voted for me. And when they hear Liz Truss saying I should be ignored, you know, what they hear is that Scotland's voting choices should be ignored or that Scotland should be ignored. And I tell you something, I think people in Scotland, you know, are really getting increasingly fed up with Tory Prime Ministers that, remember, we don't vote for and wouldn't vote for if we'd had the chance with Liz Truss, trying to ignore and talk down Scotland. And that is one of the many reasons why I think increasing numbers of people in Scotland will support Scotland being an independent country, so that that important relationship with the rest of the UK is on the basis of equality.
OK. Now, we are out of time, but there's just one thing I would like to ask you. It's something that I've spoken to you about before. I know it's something that you feel strongly about. This week, my colleagues Liz Bakes and Agnes Chamber have been looking into allegations of sexual misconduct and the culture in Westminster. And really, this crosses across all different parties, what they've been looking into. One former SNP staff member told them the attitude in Westminster is, if it's not rape, it's OK. Of course, there have been allegations about members of your own party. The Commons watchdog found Patrick Grady sexually harassed a junior member of staff. He, of course, has since quit the SNP. Are you happy with the way that your party has dealt with these allegations of sexual misconduct?
No, I think we can be better, and I'm not going to shy away from that. I think every party, every organisation dealing belatedly, I think, because too often in the past these are things that have been swept under the carpet. I think we've all got lessons to learn. I said in the context of the Patrick Grady case that we had lessons to learn, and that is the case. So we are looking at our procedures as a party, as parliamentary groups, all of the time. We've gone through a very painful process as the Scottish Government because of issues you and I have spoken about previously, and some of the scrutiny and the pressure I've had over the past few years on these issues, in particular the highest profile one of these, is because I've not been prepared simply to sweep these things under the carpet. So no, I don't think we are as good as we need to do, and that's something I take seriously, and I'm intending to ensure that we do get better so that women or men who feel that they have been the victim of sexual harassment or sexual abuse feel confident in coming forward and feel confident in the processes that they then use.
OK, thank you very much. Nicola Sturgeon, their First Minister of Scotland. Well, in a little over 27 hours, we're going to know who is the new leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It's been a long and gruelling contest. We've had hours of hustings, social media spats, policy rows. Stitching the Conservative Party back together again is not going to be easy. Well, our next guest knows better than most how Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss are going to be feeling today. He lost in 2005 to David Cameron. I hate to remind you of that, of course. That's all right. David Davis, thank you very much for being with us. Well, it looks pretty certain, doesn't it, that Liz Truss will be the next leader of your party. How do you think she's going to get on?
It looks likely. I mean, we're not sure until we see the ballots, of course, and it's a really difficult electorate to censor. But how? Well, look, she faces probably the second most difficult brief in the post-war prime ministers. I mean, the only person with a worse brief coming in was Margaret Thatcher, I think. The country was bankrupt and all sorts of other problems. But so she's got this huge set of problems. Obviously, the cost of living crisis, backing off from Ukraine, and also within that, the energy crisis, really, really difficult. I actually don't think any of the candidates, not one of them going through it, really knows quite how big this is going to be. It's going to be on a par with the furlough scheme in terms of it's going to be tens of billions of costs. It's going to be rewriting markets. It's going to be intervening.
And that's what you think should happen?
That's what should happen. It has to happen. I mean, we worry about, and we talk a lot in politics about the vulnerable. Of course, they are the most important to deal with, but also small businesses and businesses generally, employment. The whole economy is going to take a shock if you don't sort it out. So that's got to be done, and that's huge. And it'll involve, to some extent, putting your ideologies on one side. We're all free marketeers. We're all low tax enthusiasts. I mean, me more than most, I guess. But we're going to have to think, well, actually, for this next 12 months, we're going to do something different. So you've got that coming, and then a whole pack of other things behind it.
On the tax cuts, I'm interested, because as you say, you are someone who ideologically like the idea of tax cuts and believe in low taxes. Liz Truss, of course, has talked a lot about low taxes as the way forward. But do you think that actually that is not the right thing to do in the short to medium term because of the crisis? Well,
I mean, the first thing to understand is we talk about tax cuts. What she's talking about is cancelling tax increases. That's the first thing. And it is quite an important difference. I'm not too worried about the national insurance cancellation. Actually, that will now end up, given the way that Rishi amended it, as being a net tax cut, because he's taken 70% of people out of it. The corporation tax, I think they're going to have to think quite hard about, actually. I'd like a low headline tax, but these days, vast amounts of corporate money goes to buying back shares and propping up their own share price and so on. We've got to think about how that works. So there's quite a lot to be done there, but in principle, it's the right direction. But she's going to find balance in the books really difficult. If I'm right about the costs of the energy crisis, tens upon tens of billions of pounds, not in the long term, but in the short term. And you add to that the necessary increase in defence costs because of Ukraine. You add to that the necessary increase in NHS costs. It's going to be quite difficult to make the books balance. And the worst outcome is, as it were, to give low taxes a bad name by going down a route which leads to an increase in interest costs, massive increases in people's mortgages, and/or a decline in the pound. The pound's been going down systematically over the last year or so. If it drops off a cliff, then we're going to have more inflation. So that this is a really, really difficult balancing job. It's not for nothing that Margaret Thatcher actually put taxes up earlier in her years. Now, I don't think that's the right thing to do either, but it's difficult. The point I'm making is a knife-edge calculation she has to make. I
mean, as you say, it is difficult. It's a very difficult outlook. It's going to be a bumpy road, whoever ends up winning tomorrow. Can you say with 100% certainty that whoever wins tomorrow, assuming it's Liz Truss, will lead the Conservative Party into the next election?
That's only 2 years away, so it's a sort of 90-something% probability. But more pressing than that, in a way, is what you sort of intimated when you introduced me. And that is that there is a real risk the party will sort of feel divided, And that means if that's the case, we won't win the next election. And so it's going to be really important that she pulls people in.
So what do you think that the Cabinet needs to involve different people from different factions of the party?
I mean, look,
would you like to see Rishi Sunak offered a job?
I would. I mean, look, the greatest mistake that Boris Johnson made, I mean, there were a few, but right back at the beginning, and it sort of slightly shocked me, was the fact that he basically created a cabinet of loyalists. It wasn't a meritocratic cabinet. It wasn't the best people. Jeremy Hunt was offered a demotion, so obviously didn't take it. Others like Liam Fox or indeed Penny Mordaunt wasn't in cabinet. Which absolutely justified a place. And there were other. I could give you a list of half a dozen who should have been there and who might have talked to him and talked him out of some of the silly things he did, ranging from some of the mistakes on COVID through to the mistakes on handling the House of Commons.
And looking at the people who were talked about as being in the next Liz Truss cabinet, are you worried she was going to make the same mistake?
I'm slightly worried. I think that, look, it's always tempting, if you're going to win this sort of thing, you've had people who've been around you since the beginning. You want to be loyal to them, and so on. But actually, your loyalty is to a bigger entity. Your loyalty is to the country and the party, and that's hard. That's hard to do on the first day. So but I think she has to brace herself and do it.
What kind of job do you think Rishi Sunak, for example, should be offered?
Well, you could offer him Foreign Secretary. He'd do that very well. She won't want to put him back in as Chancellor because they have very different views on that, and that's public. I mean, something very senior, so in top half dozen anyway.
Do you think that she might be tempted to call an early election?
No, actually. Everybody talks about it. The opposition, of course, always call for it as well. But no, I mean, we've got an 80 majority, you know. There was a suggestion when Boris was going out, as it were, that he might call an election. And the suggestion came right back from the palace, and we may not grant one. You know, the conditions for an election are you need to have one to deliver a majority in the House of Commons. There not that need at the moment.
And finally, on Boris Johnson, there are rumours that he could be persuaded to come back.
Well, rumours probably coming from Boris Johnson's camp. I dismiss most of this stuff about a resurgence of Boris. Boris has got some really tough times in the next few months, what with the Privileges Committee and so on. And people, I mean, you know, if he had not gone because of the resignation of whatever it was, 50 ministers, the very next week, the party would have passed a vote of no confidence in him. That's why that all happened. We forget that he lost the confidence of the party, and I don't think he'll get that back in a hurry.
OK, thank you very much indeed. David Davis there. Well, we were just talking, of course, about Boris Johnson, and the removal vans have been in and out of Downing Street this week as he prepares to stand down from the job he always wanted as Prime Minister. Well, his premiership has been many things, but you couldn't say it wasn't memorable.
This morning I went to Buckingham Palace and I am forming a new government. Tonight, we are leaving the European Union. For many people, this is an astonishing moment of hope. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody, you'll be pleased to know. I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Now, I'm just hearing at this moment that the Prime Minister has been taken into an intensive care unit.
We've been asking for action, as you know, on coal, cars, cash and trees. Ukraine will win, and Britain will be by your side. All guidance was followed completely during Number 10. I apologise unreservedly for the offence that it has caused up and down the country.
We're just hearing that Sajid Javid has resigned.
I think Rishi Sunak has just resigned.
As we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. I want to thank everybody here, and hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
Hasta la vista, baby. Well, one person who knows Boris Johnson better than most is Lord Lister, Eddie Lister, who's been by his side all the way back to when he was Mayor of London. And I think we can see a couple of photos of him. Here he is by Boris Johnson's side at the announcement of the winner of the Conservative Party leadership in 2019. He then became Mr Johnson's Chief Strategic Advisor and then Downing Street Chief of Staff. So if you want to know about Boris Johnson, he's the man you want to talk to. And here he is. Thank you very much for being with us today. You know, I've been looking forward to interviewing you because I feel like you perhaps know Boris Johnson better than anyone I've actually interviewed before on this programme. So, you know, when on Tuesday he travels to Balmoral to meet with the Queen, how do you think he's going to be feeling?
Oh, very sad. I mean, this is a job he always wanted, and it was the pinnacle of his political career. And so he's going to be very sad that day. And he's also going to look back and he's going to, I am sure, just feel that, you know, what if, it's the old what if business. What if some things were done differently? Would it have ended up like this? It's hard to ever know, but it's not going to be a nice journey for him.
You say kind of what if, and of course, as you say, this is a man who always wanted to be, you know, Prime Minister. I think he once talked about wanting to be world king when he was a child.
Yes, I remember that.
Do you feel that he'll be frustrated that he didn't even manage 3 years on the job?
Oh yes, yes, of course. I mean, and I mean, he has been taken out of that role before his time, but I mean, I think it's naive to believe that the party or MPs were not going to go for him at various times. And so, to some extent, he's been on ice for a little bit of a while now, while he's dealt with some of these various issues.
Do you think that his premiership will be seen as a success?
I think in hindsight, yes, because I think he has achieved a lot.
What specifically?
Well, I think the first thing has to be, of course, that he defeated Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn could have brought in, and he was a very strong candidate, and could have brought in a Labour government, a very left-wing Labour government.
But that's a campaigning success, isn't it?
Yes.
Like, what as Prime Minister has he achieved?
Immediately you must move on, I think, to Brexit. Brexit was completed and achieved against enormous opposition in Parliament, enormous opposition within the courts, and it was a very painful process. He completed that. He also was the Prime Minister over COVID, and undoubtedly, and perhaps we could talk about this, I don't know, it was his drive to get vaccines, which you have to credit him with that, above anybody else. But that was a tough time. And then, of course, Ukraine. Without his commitment to Ukraine, I don't think America or Europe would have been as robust as they are.
You know, on COVID, because obviously you were right there in the room where as many of those decisions were happening, you had a sort of ringside seat. Another person who did was Dominic Cummings, who has a very different take to you. He describes Boris Johnson as a shopping trolley, veering all over the place. In January, he said it was his duty to get rid of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, saying it was sort of like fixing the drains. Has he got a point?
No. I'm sorry, I don't think he has. And I'm very sorry that that Dominic felt he could no longer work for Boris. He was a very talented man, but I think he was just plain wrong on this. What you've got to remember with COVID is that right at the beginning, nobody knew anything. The advice was contradictory. Everybody was saying different things. There was a moment in time where it was the advisors were saying herd immunity was the answer, don't do anything. Then the next one was you've got to get vaccines, that's the essential one. Then it was don't wear masks, they're not, they don't work. Then it was wear masks. The advice coming in to him, and I could plenty of other examples, was always contradictory. So he had to make judgments. And you must remember, it nearly killed him. So he was very personal about it. He knew what it was like for people to have got to that point where they were intensive care.
Did it shake him, that experience? Because you see the sort of bombastic side of Boris Johnson, you know, kind of shrugging it off, trying to get back to work, the Partygate, trying to stop him from, you know, going down to refusing to isolate from number 10.
Oh, that wasn't right. No. Yes, it did shake him. It did shake him. I always remember one conversation. And it was one of those many conversations done. I can't remember now whether it was done on a Zoom from within the building. It was done shouting through the door. But he went into a coughing fit and he said, "God, this is awful." That was, I think, the first time I realised that he was ill, really ill, because he's not somebody who reacts to illness at all. And that was the moment. So it did shake him, yes.
I think there was a lot of anger, of course, as well, about the feeling that rules were stretched and in some cases broken in Downing Street when everyone else had to follow the rules. I mean, you were there at the time. Were you at any of those parties that were investigated?
No, I wasn't. But then come Friday night, I wouldn't want to be around Downing Street. I wanted to go home. And to be absolutely fair, he wasn't either. I mean, a lot of this...
He received a fine from the police.
Yes, he did for a particular incident. Yes, he did.
So
that was the one where he, as a surprise, they brought him in a birthday cake just before the start of a meeting, and Rishi Sunak also got a fine for that as well. I always thought that was deeply unfair, actually, because he didn't set out to have a surprise birthday cake. That was actually just before I can't even remember now today what meeting that was. It was one I wasn't at, so I don't know. But no, what I was going to say was that most of the incidents of parties were not parties as you or I know them. They were people, some of the younger staff having a drink at the end of a Friday when they'd been there all week. Remember, nobody was at home. They were all in the building.
There are these questions about integrity, which in the end led to Boris Johnson's downfall. You know, whether it was being fined by the police over Partygate, his handling of these allegations of sexual misconduct with Chris Pincher, frankly, his relationship with the truth as well. He's been investigated over whether he misled Parliament. Many people look at him and think this is not a man of integrity.
I don't agree. He is... I've never known somebody quite as tough on this as him. He is a very, very straightforward individual. He would never knowingly break the law. That is not him. He genuinely, in those instances you talked about, a couple of them, and he's apologised for them. He did not believe he was breaking the law. He wouldn't have done it if he'd believed that.
I mean, there have also been questions about your own conduct as well while we're in government. You were also director of Edward Lister Consultants and advisor to the property group Delancey, non-executive director to Stanhope Holdings. Is that not a conflict of interest?
Not really, no. They were all things... No. Firstly, they were all declared. I mean, let me be quite clear about that. And secondly, I was still doing a little bit of work there for myself, but it was nothing to do with any government work. It was all to do with very specific work for it. In fact, it was largely shut down while I was in Parliament. So, no, I don't believe there was anything. And certainly it was all stuff that I declared.
But if it's declared, does that not mean if you just declare it, then you can effectively just do what you want?
I suppose you could do it that way, but I didn't. I virtually did nothing while I was...
So why do anything at all, then, if it was virtually nothing?
Well, because when I went into Downing Street, I went in for a very short period of time. I was originally going in for 3 months. And then that changed to get Brexit done and the general election. And then, just as I was going to leave, COVID struck. So I stayed longer than I ever planned to stay. And that was the reason. In hindsight, I should have completely got rid of those things. But
how much money were you making?
Oh, it wasn't much. It was very little.
What does that mean?
No, I'm not going to go into that. In fact, I'm not awfully sure now. But it was very small.
Let's look forward. The new Prime Minister is going to be... We're going to find out who it's going to be tomorrow. Who would you like it to be?
I think now, and having watched the debate as it's unfolded, I think Liz Truss, because I am one of those who believe that you can't do what you've always done and get the same result. And so I think we do need to change. And I think the proposals she's putting forward are going to bring about a lot of change. I think they're going to be very hard. It's going to be very difficult. I wouldn't envy anybody entering into Downing Street on Tuesday. It's going to be tough. But I think she's probably the best person for the job. You
know, as you say, it is going to be tough. The set of situation that they're going to find themselves in number 10 and number 11 is going to be almost sort of unprecedented in memory. What policy platform would you like her to take forward?
I think the important thing is she's got to deal with the big issues. She's got to continue Boris Johnson's legacy over Ukraine and got to stay robust over Ukraine, because I still believe that's the single most dangerous issue that's out there. I know it's not top of everybody's list, but it is the most dangerous one. The second one is, of course, cost of living. And she's putting forward a number of proposals on that. She's talked about tax cuts. She's talked about some targeted help. She's not spelt that out yet, and I'm sure she will be doing that. And she's also talked about a rethink about energy. And I think that's right, because it's not just a short-term problem. There's also a long-term problem here that needs to be dealt with.
There are some reports that Conservative MPs and members are experiencing a bit of seller's remorse over Boris Johnson.
Well, so they should. Sorry. I mean, I just think I think they did the wrong thing. I think they overreacted. I think they got too much into their Twitter accounts and stopped thinking straight. And I don't think it was a good move. I think he was the best Prime Minister we've had. I think he would continue to be a good Prime Minister. I think he would be very successful in a further general election. However, that's yesterday. That's gone. So
has it gone? Do you think he might be tempted?
Oh, well, maybe in the future. I'd never say never on anything with Boris Johnson. Anything is possible in the future. But for now, we have a new leader. And as he said yesterday, the party now needs to rally behind, and the MPs need to rally behind the new leader.
So never say never. Do you think it may be that he gives Liz Truss a chance, sees what happens, but if, as someone once said, the ball came loose at the back of the scrum?
Look, he is an amazing person. He is full of energy. He works extremely hard. He is going to be watching all this, and if something happens in the future, as you said, but the ball comes loose in the scrum, then anything can happen. I'm not going to predict. All I'm saying is I would never write him off.
OK, thank you very much. Fascinating to talk. Lord Lister there.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk now about the cost of living crisis that really has been at the sort of centre of our interviews this morning. One thing that really struck me over the summer is the disconnect between some of the political debate in Westminster and what people are experiencing in their own lives across the United Kingdom, and whether that's what's happening in your local school or hospital, or trying to work out how on earth your wages are going to cover your energy and food bills. You know, it seems to me more important than ever to hear some of those voices and to put those real-life experiences to the people who have the levers to do something about it, our political guests. Well, there's only one place to start this week: energy bills. We've been looking at the impact on small business, who, of course, aren't protected by the price cap. Now, a typical pub was paying about £15,500 on energy. That's expected to rise to just under £50,000, according to the British Beer and Pub Association, up more than 200%. Now, the industry employs some 940,000 people, and there are around 47,000 pubs in the United Kingdom. So we can talk now to the owner of a pub to find out what is going on. This morning, we're going to take you to Thornton-le-Dale, a very picturesque village in North Yorkshire. At the centre of that village is the Buck Inn. We can talk to its owner, Abbie Marshall, now. Thank you so much for being on the programme this morning, Abbie. Just talk us through first, how much have your energy bills gone up?
So just to put it into context, we bought the pub in September 21, so 12 months ago. We are not connected to mains gas here, so we run off an LPG tank. When we filled the tank, when we moved in September 21, to when we filled the tank 4 weeks ago, that had gone up 285%. We're due to get our new electricity bill, which we are predicting is due to come in on Monday, which will be 300%. So if you add that all together, I'm predicting, Sophie, my utilities should go from about 22,000 to about 58,000.
Wow, so that really is, you know, a big rise. You must be hit by food price inflation as well.
Yeah, and I think the problem is as well, Sophie, whilst obviously everybody's talking about utilities at the moment, and it is extremely important, for the past 6 months, you know, hospitality and all small businesses, we've been seeing direct cost of doing business escalating beyond what we've ever seen before. And the problem is, you know, when you're running a small business or any business and you're trying to control your costs, and every single direct cost of your business is escalating at a point that you have no control over it, it's very worrying. Cost of food, cost of beer, utilities, VAT, for example. VAT was 5%, that's gone to 20%. So we've just paid our first VAT bill at 20%, which was excruciatingly painful. Business rates as well, you know, they're 50% at the moment, but again, they're due to go up to 100%. So what you're looking at is, you know, you're forecasting and you're looking at your P&L, and every single line on your P&L is just growing, and it's not stopping, you know, it's just completely escalating. And then there comes a point where you can't streamline your business. You can't look at your business and say, how do we deal with these costs? Because every single one of those costs really is out of your control. It's
really, you know, we spoke about the increase in your energy bills. You know, when you told my producer that fish and chips has had to go up from $12.95 to $17.95.
Yeah,
just 300% rise in fish.
Absolutely, just a silly example, Sophie. You know, $12.95 September 21, $17.95 now. What we started doing as well is we've started moving away from menus, permanent menus, just because the price fluctuation on product and inventory is so up and down at the moment that if we were to physically print a menu, I can guarantee within 3 to 4 weeks, a lot of those prices will be obsolete. So we've gone to specials boards where we can change the pricing week by week or every couple of weeks. The chefs are continuously looking at price point. And I think the scary thing is how quickly it changes. That's definitely something that's sort of really hit home for me, is the speed in which it changes. Is the fact that you try and put it together a set of figures, and within a couple of weeks, those aren't correct. You're behind.
It's really, it is a bit of an eye-opener, to be honest, talking to you this morning and just getting the kind of real-world example about what rising inflation actually means.
Yeah.
It's one of those words you kind of chuck around in political interviews, and you don't really think about the real-world examples in terms of, fish and chips or a pint at your pub, and of course all the people that rely on those businesses as well. Liz Truss, we believe, or maybe Rishi Sunak, are going to be setting out their plan to deal with the cost of living and energy in the coming week. What do you need? If the next Prime Minister was watching this now, what do you need them to do?
I think there's a few things, Sophie. Well, from my perspective, and obviously I can't speak for all SMEs and small businesses, but I think obviously VAT jumping from 5 to 20% has been a huge issue for us. I'd like to see a cut in VAT. I'd like to see a holiday on business rates, which we've been talking about business rates for a decade. It's a system that doesn't work. It's not representative of the market as it is now. So I think that whole system needs looking at. And I think there needs to be a cap on utilities. Ultimately, we're an employer. Just an example, we're in a very small village, but if we were to go, you'd be looking at 15 to 17 people without jobs. So when you start looking at that's just one small pub in a small village, the scale of the problem times that by 30,000 pubs, and that's just hospitality, never mind your bakeries and your cafes and your other small businesses. So VAT, business rates, holiday, and a cap on utilities would be a start. But then I think we've got to think about how do we future-proof our businesses moving forward. We unfortunately we use a lot of energy. We have fridges, we have ovens, we have cooling systems, we have cellars. There's got to be some sort of long-term idea of how we move forward as a sector and what we get. Are we going to? They're going to enable us to install green energy? Are we going to be able to install solar? Something just to future-proof ourselves from this happening again.
Thank you so much. It's been really interesting to talk to you this morning, Abbie. And good luck in the months ahead. Let's hope there's something for you next week.
Thanks, Sophie.
Well, we're going to be talking to people like Abbie and just getting some of those real-world examples every Sunday going on. Well, time now to get the view from Labour, because the party, of course, keen to focus on the cost of living crisis and has put forward its own plans on energy prices. We can talk now to Labour's Nick Thomas-Symonds, who is the Shadow International Trade Secretary. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. It looks like Liz Truss is going to be the next Prime Minister. Would she be an improvement on the last one?
Well, first of all, very good to join you this morning, Sophie. Whether she will be an improvement on Boris Johnson, who frankly trashed the office of Prime Minister, only time in the end will tell. What I've seen over the summer, frankly, are two Conservative leadership candidates living in some sort of parallel reality. I think of the constituents who are emailing me, who are speaking to me whenever I'm out and about, who are so fearful about the pressures on family budgets this winter. And yet the Conservative Party has spent well over 2 months talking to itself and left in place a zombie government that frankly has been doing nothing over the summer whilst people are so incredibly worried.
It certainly does feel like people are concerned about the cost of living crisis going forward. She has said, of course, that she wants to have immediate action on energy bills to try and, help families and also businesses, and then tax cuts. Some people listening to that might be thinking, that sounds pretty good.
Well, we'll have to just see what is actually brought forward next week to be able to judge that. I mean, the debate over the summer has not particularly shown a focus on what people are facing, or indeed an understanding of the scale of the crisis. But what we are saying very clearly is freeze energy bills, freeze that price cap so people are not paying a penny more, and take that worry away from people. And also, I listened with interest, Sophie, to your last interview. We also need to be putting in place support for businesses. And what Labour is saying is we would be putting in place a contingency fund of £1 billion for energy-intensive businesses. And in addition to that, we would be raising the threshold at which business rates are paid before then actually reforming business rates. And we'd be raising that money from an increase in the digital services tax. So we've got to be helping households, we've got to be helping businesses as well.
I'm also interested to know your take on whether or not there might be an early election. There has been a bit of speculation. Is Labour on an election footing?
We are absolutely on an election footing, and I want to see this government swept away as soon as possible. These are continuity candidates, and part of the Conservative debate over the summer has been about all the problems that have been caused by 12 years of Conservative rule. To sweep this government away, we need to have that general election, and we in Labour want to see that general election happen as soon as we possibly can, so we can get on with the job of rebuilding our country's economy and standing beside people in this acute cost of living crisis that looks like is only going to get worse in the months ahead.
We spoke to Lord Lister also earlier on the programme, of course, someone who's been very close to Boris Johnson for a long time, and he said that he wouldn't rule out a return to frontline politics for Boris Johnson. If the ball came loose at the back of the scrum, he wouldn't rule anything out. Do you think that Boris Johnson could come back?
It really does show the depths to which the Conservative Party has sunk, and the fact that they are so tired after 12 years in office, that they've just ousted a leader after his flagrant disregard for COVID rules, after he showed time and again it was one rule for him and another rule for the rest of the population. It really does show now the Conservative Party has completely lost its way. If they are saying credibly that they want to get rid of one leader, then try to have a leadership contest with others, then try and bring the other leader back. The only way we're ever going to get a fresh start is to sweep the Conservatives away completely.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Nick Thomas-Symonds there for the Labour Party. Well, it is hard to believe, just 2.5 years after the biggest contraction in the UK economy for 300 years, we're talking about what could be a bigger economic crisis than COVID. Energy prices soaring with war in Ukraine, inflation at levels not seen for 40 years, concerns about poverty and vulnerable people struggling to heat or eat. It's pretty grim, and it will, of course, be the political background for years to come. So what should the next Prime Minister do? Well, Philip Hammond became Chancellor in the economic uncertainty after the Brexit referendum. He joins us now. Thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
I'm very interested to hear your take on what the economic picture actually is and what the next months and potentially years could look like. How bad could it be?
Well, it looks to me that it's very challenging in the short term, but I think that the longer term prognosis is a bit better for the UK. If I were advising the incoming Prime Minister, my advice would be to be very honest with the British people about the challenges we're facing in the short term and how we're going to deal with them. Of course, the government is going to have to provide support to deal with massive energy bills in the short term. But I think the incoming Prime Minister's got to be clear about what the government can do and what it can't do. It can help with the short-term pressures, the bit of this in energy inflation, which is temporary, cyclical, related to the war in Ukraine.
But what we're talking about here is people not being able to afford to heat their homes,
sure.
Right? And pay their food bills.
And the government will, can and should intervene to help with that short-term pressure. But to the extent that some element of the increase in energy costs is going to be structural, long-term, as we seek to become more energy independent in the future, as we seek to decarbonise in the future, government's got to be honest with people that represents a change in our priorities for consumption. And I think this has always been a bit of an issue that we've had about being open and honest with people about what the decarbonisation agenda over the medium and long term.
What does that mean in layman terms? What the decarbonisation?
It means that.
Do you mean the green agenda?
The green agenda. It means that energy is going to be more expensive than it was before the current crisis. Not the levels it is now, because those levels are driven to a very significant extent by short-term temporary factors. But we are going to have to face the fact that to decarbonise our economy, to tackle global warming, we are going to have, in the long term, higher energy prices than we were used to having a couple of years ago. And I think the government just needs to be honest and open with people. We also need to be clear that the short-term measures that I'm sure will be announced in the next few days to help people over this winter have got to be paid for somehow. They can't all just be done through borrowing. We're dealing with an inflation crisis. Borrowing adds more stimulus to the economy. That is exactly the opposite of what we should be trying to do to dampen down inflation.
So, by finding a way to pay for it, do you mean spending cuts?
It means reprioritising, and that's what people around the world are doing. They're saying, look, we've got this programme over here.
Does reprioritising mean spending cuts?
It means postponing or delaying things that the government might have wanted to do in the winter of 22-23.
So
because we need to push that money into helping people with energy bills, just as people would do with their own budgets. If a problem comes up, you immediately reprioritise. That's what you do. The government has to do the same. It can't just go out and borrow hundreds of billions of pounds more, because that will only stimulate more inflation.
Are you concerned that that is what Liz Truss effectively will be doing?
Well, I would be concerned if that was what the new government decides to do. I don't think it will. I think it will certainly want to do some borrowing, but I hope that it will do some reprioritisation as well, reflecting the fact that inflation is the challenge.
Reflecting the fact that inflation is the challenge, we've also been talking an awful lot about tax cuts. Rishi Sunak, but also clearly Liz Truss, at seeing tax cuts as a priority, something that the IFS has said that could add to the inflation. Would tax cuts add to inflation?
Yes. I mean, tax cuts now, everything else being equal, would deliver an inflationary stimulus. That is not the right thing to do. I think David Davis...
tax cuts aren't the right thing to do right now?
No, I think David Davis said earlier, and I'd agree with him, that we are a party that advocates low taxes. We need the new government to have a very clear set of conservative philosophical principles, including the desire to contain the state, keep taxes as low as possible. But those have to be the long-term guiding principles for our policy agenda. In the short term, we have to be pragmatic, and cutting taxes at a time when we have a huge deficit, £160 billion probably this year of government borrowing, when inflation is the major problem we have to tackle, is simply not the answer. And of course, the other thing is, throughout this decade, the 2020s, we always knew we were going to have exceptional pressure on public services because of the ageing profile of our population. If the government can manage to hold taxes stable, that will be an immense achievement, in my view.
Liz Truss has acknowledged this morning that tax cuts would benefit the wealthier more than those on lower incomes, or, of course, those on benefits as well. Does that add to your view that right now is not the time for tax cuts?
Well, it depends how you structure them, but I think there are many reasons why tax cuts in the immediate future will not be the right way to tackle this crisis. I think the government needs to provide targeted support to those most in need around the immediate crisis over energy bills. We don't know what the future is going to be, but there is a good chance that energy inflation will abate during the course of 2023, and we will find that we've got over this immediate crisis.
You were also talking about borrowing and the concerns that you have about borrowing. Are you worried that the Conservative reputation for fiscal responsibility, you had the austerity years, of course, with George Osborne. You were someone who I think was described as Eeyore by some of the tabloids in your time. Are you concerned that the Conservative reputation for fiscal responsibility is at stake right now?
Yes, and I'm concerned that the Conservative reputation for competent government is at stake. And I think the new government needs to decide from day one to be honest with the public, to reach out across the Tory party and beyond to show that it will be a government that governs for the whole country, that it's a government that's underpinned by a clear set of principles and values, and those would include sound money, balanced budgets, paying our way in the world, good Tory principles, but that it is also pragmatic and it will deal with the specific problems that we're facing, like the cost of living crisis right now. So a strong set of underpinning values that inform our long-term agenda, but an absolute commitment to pragmatism and competent government, competent management on a day-to-day basis.
Who did you vote for?
I haven't endorsed either candidate publicly, and I'm not going to do so now.
OK. Is there... OK. Reading between the lines, it feels like you may be more on the Rishi Sunak side than the Liz Truss side. Am I overstepping?
Look, I look at the bookies' odds, I look at the polling, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have a Truss government. I've worked very closely with Liz Truss. She was Chief Secretary to the Treasury while I was Chancellor. She was a formidable Chief Secretary. She works very hard. She is very diligent. And I think she can make a very good Prime Minister, but she must do it by being inclusive. She'll send a clear signal as early as Tuesday when she starts to form her cabinet. And it must be a cabinet that reflects the talent across the Conservative Party and sends a message to the country that this will be a government that focuses on delivery, on competence, on honesty, and on applying those values in a pragmatic way.
Nicola Sturgeon, earlier in this programme, said she was no shrinking violet. Would you agree with that description?
Oh, she's a tough cookie, and anyone who's had to deal with Liz Truss as Chief Secretary to the Treasury negotiating their spending settlement will know that very well. I know her as a colleague, as somebody who got things done, and that's a rarer commodity than you might think in government. But you ask her to do something, it would always be done. That's a pretty good credential for being Prime Minister.
We are out of time, but just quickly, there's some speculation that Boris Johnson could mount a comeback. Eddie Lister, Lord Lister, told me earlier on the show that if the ball came loose from the back of the scrum, he wouldn't rule out Boris Johnson picking it up. What do you make of that?
I think this is fantasy. I think Boris has not been a good Prime Minister. I think he's damaged the office of Prime Minister. I think he's damaged the Tory party. And I think Boris will no doubt have a very successful career in other fields in the future. And I think he should move on and put aside any idea of hanging like a sort of malevolent shadow over the next government. He needs to let the new Prime Minister get on with his or her job and make it clear that he's moved on as well.
Do you think that he hasn't done that yet, then?
I think he hasn't done it yet.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Philip Hammond. Well, a big programme, of course, today, because it's going to be a very big week next week. Tomorrow, we're going to be finding out who will be the leader of the Conservative Party. Tuesday is when, of course, we will be finding out the Prime Minister resigning. And then on Wednesday will be another important day, the first meeting of the new Cabinet, the new Prime Minister facing the Commons for the first time at Prime Minister's Questions. And we can add to that list the return of our midweek programme, The Take, as well. So do come and joining us at 9 p.m. On Wednesdays. It's our chance to take the political temperature in the middle of the week with some big interviews, a bit of analysis from the journalists, data on the state of play in UK politics, and a panel of viewers to give us their take on all of the big political news. Now, if you want to be involved in that conversation, then do please send us an email, thetake@sophyridge@sky.uk. The email should be on your screens right now. Just a couple of lines about yourself and your politics. And it's going to be a pretty extraordinary week next week and next Wednesday as well. So definitely want to tune into there. Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. It is good to be back. In a moment, after the break, we'll be running through today's interviews, finding out what we learned with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning.
We support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.